Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Zoom-based webinar. My name is Professor Ani Hovannisian, and it is my privilege as the director of the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA to welcome you to the latest of our many joint events held in partnership with the Armenian Film Foundation. This lecture is entitled The Ruins of Ani, a Photographic Journey from 1881 to the Present, and features remarkable documentation of the medieval ruins of the ancient Armenian capital of Ani, known as the City of 1001 Churches. Ani is located in present-day Turkey's province of Kars, adjacent to the closed border with the Republic of Armenia. This photographic journey will be presented by two individuals, Joseph Malikian, curator of the new Armenian Image Archive and the founder of the Malikian collection, and by Stephen Sim, an independent researcher based in Scotland with a special interest in the architecture of historical Armenia and how recent history and politics have impacted its preservation. We are delighted to welcome Joe and Stephen to our virtual stage, and also to welcome Dr. Carla Garabedian of the Armenian Film Foundation as my partner in coordinating this event. For today's webinar, I am grateful to note the co-sponsorship by the UCLA Richard Hovannisian Endowed Chair in Modern Armenian History, the UCLA Nadakatsi Endowed Chair in Armenian Studies, the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, or NASR, and the Araratiskidjian Museum. And on behalf of the co-sponsors here at UCLA, I would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the indigenous Gabrielino Tongva peoples. And especially at this moment, I would like to express on behalf of our UCLA Promise Armenian Institute family, our sorrow at the loss of life and injuries resulting from the recent earthquakes in Syria and Turkey, and to express our continued horror and outrage at the humanitarian crisis that was triggered on December 12, 2022, by the blockage of the Sol Mountain Road linking Artsakh, or Nagorno-Karabakh, to Armenia by Azerbaijani activists. This blockade of the transport of essential food, medicine, and supplies is inflicting collective harm on 120,000 innocent civilians, and we call on the international community to accelerate humanitarian interventions and to amplify pressure on Azerbaijan to end this illegal blockade. And now back to our webinar. My colleague and friend, Dr. Carla Garabedian, will provide a formal introduction for our speakers in a moment. But let me note that for those of you who are watching live via the Zoom webinar platform, you have an opportunity to send questions to us by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom portion of your screen and typing in the question. Please be sure to be as specific and succinct as possible in your questions, and we will direct as many of the questions as are practical to our speakers when they are finished. We anticipate that the webinar itself will take around 45 minutes, after which we will begin the Q&A portion of the event. And also, please note that this event is being recorded for future viewing at our Promise Armenian Institute website and YouTube channel. In the unlikely event that the Zoom webinar drops for any reason, please just connect right back to the same link, as it will put you back into our Zoom session. And now it gives me great pleasure to turn the webinar over to the well-known filmmaker, director, writer, and broadcaster, Dr. Carla Garabedian. Dr. Garabedian earned her undergraduate and Ph.D. degrees in international relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science before working as a producer, director, and foreign correspondent based in Britain. For a number of years, she was an anchor for the BBC World News, after which she directed Dying for the President about Chechnya, Lifting the Veil about women in Afghanistan, and Iran Undercover for PBS Frontline World. Her award-winning 2006 feature film, Screamers, depicts genocides of the past century with a focus on the Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1923. Dr. Kurkdjian is the recipient of numerous recognitions from the National Academy of Sciences, in the Republic of Armenia, the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute, and many others. She has worked for many years with the Armenian Film Foundation, one of the preeminent centers for visual images of Armenian history and culture, and the Promise Armenian Institute is proud to partner with this impactful organization in our event today. So, Carla, I will now turn the webinar over to you for an introduction of our speakers.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for that introduction. And a big thank you to our host, Promise Armenian Institute, and to all of our co-sponsors. We're very grateful for your support. And I want to thank also Ruben Berberian, who helped us develop the Runes of Ani exhibit at the Armenian Image Archive. That exhibit will be launched this Friday, and the link will be posted in the chat section. So you can go and look at this new exhibition on Ani on Friday. Ruben Berberian has his own remarkable collection of Ani photos that he's taken over the years, which helped orient us as we were creating this new exhibit. Thank you, Ruben, for allowing us access to your photos. Now, my last thanks go to our first contributor, Dr. Joseph Malikian. Without his undying interest in Armenian history and photography, we wouldn't be holding this event today. Dr. Malikian acquired the full set of Ohannes Kurkdjian's stereoscopic images of Ani, and it is that set of historical photographs that is informing this discussion today. That and Dr. Malikian's mission to understand important Armenian photographers like Ohannes Kurkdjian. Dr. Malikian is the founder of the Malikian collection. He's the author of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, and he's the curator of the Armenian Image Archive. He's gathered an amazing collection of vintage images from many Armenian photographic studios dating from the 1860s. Our second contributor is Stephen Sim, who's joining us from Scotland. Now, if you're a student listening to this, here's some inspiration for you. Stephen Sim was an architectural student in Glasgow in the early 1980s when he first traveled to Turkey for the summer. And on that first trip, he discovered a landscape of abandoned Armenian buildings, many regarded as architectural masterpieces. This first encounter led to his lifelong mission to chronicle the remaining sites and relics of historic Armenia. He's traveled alone every year from Scotland to photograph the vanishing traces of Armenian history. Stephen Sim has taken more than, get this, 150,000 photographs of Armenian sites in Turkey. He's the creator of Virtual Ani, a comprehensive online site dedicated to these many sites, including Ani. He's since given presentations about Ani and Armenian architecture in London, Boston, Montreal, Los Angeles, and New York. And he's worked with the renowned organization Research on Armenian Architecture, RAA, spearheaded by Samvel Karapetyan in 1982. Now, in 2005, on behalf of RAA, Sim visited Azerbaijan's Nakhchivan region to assess the condition of its Armenian monuments. Along with a delegation in October 2006, Stephen Sim met with Director General of UNESCO in Paris to protest UNESCO's inaction over the Julfa medieval cemetery destruction. You may have recently seen Stephen Sim in the PBS documentary, The Hidden Map, directed by Ani Hovannisian, which charts Sim's various journeys to Turkey. And as a reminder, you can see his photographs of Ani in the Armenian Image Archive exhibit, which is being launched this Friday, March 10th. So now we're going to go to our first presentation by Dr. Joseph Malikian, who has a cold today, but he's soldiering through it. Take it away, Dr. Joseph.
Okay, thank you, Carla. Okay. Again, thank you, Carla. And I also want to extend I don't know if you can see my screen. Is it on or?
Not yet.
Not yet. Hold on. Okay. I think it's on now, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Again, I want to thank Carla and also extend a special thanks to the Promise Armenian Institute and to all the co-sponsors hosting this event. You know, one important aspect of the Armenian Image Archives mission has been the study of the Armenian men and women behind the camera's lens, many of whom were pioneers in the history of photography and many who made major contributions to the photographic medium. Given this mission, my presentation today will be devoted to the life and work of Ohannes Kurkdjian, whose photographic output, as you will see, was truly quite compelling. His photographs span different regions over the course of many decades, and his history is also marked by some controversy. To do justice in the telling of Kurkdjian's contributions to the photographic medium, my presentation will consist of two parts. The first part will focus on the photographs Kurkdjian took in 1879 of the ancient ruins of Ani, which, as many of you know, Ani is situated in Turkey's northeastern province of Kars and is adjacent to the closed border with the Republic of Armenia. The second part of my presentation will examine Kurkdjian's fascinating work in Surabaya, Indonesia, which was once part of colonial Dutch East Indies. Ohannes Kurkdjian was born in 1851 in Burun, a town and district of Sivas, province of Turkey. Upon completion of an apprenticeship in Europe in 1870, he moved to Tiflis, Georgia, to establish a commercial photographic practice. During the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878, he served as a photographer for the Russian army in the northeastern sections of Turkey. While he was in the region, Kurkdjian's deep desire to see parts of his ancestral homeland in the Armenian highlands prompted him to visit the ruins of Ani. He was captivated and inspired by the remnants of this medieval kingdom. To give you just a brief historical overview of Ani, from 961 to 1045, the medieval city of Ani served as the last capital of the Bagratuni Armenian dynasty. At its peak, this kingdom was the center of Armenian civilization. Within a period of 40 to 50 years, Ani was transformed from a small fortress town to a large medieval city. In 992, the Armenian Catholicosate moved its seat to Ani. With the many churches and chapels that were constructed on the sacred site, it has been symbolically dubbed as the city of 1001 churches. Ani was one of the world's largest cities with a population well over 100,000. With the city controlling trade routes between Byzantium, Persia, Syria, and Central Asia, it was an important crossroads and trading hub for merchant caravans. So for Kurkdjian, visiting the ruins of Ani and making a rediscovery of Armenia's past seemed to arouse strong nationalist sentiments about his cultural heritage. After the Russo-Turkish War in 1879, Kurkdjian relocated to Yerevan, Armenia, to establish a photographic studio. In the summer of 1879, after Russia won the war and acquired the regions of Kars and Ardahan from Turkey, Kurkdjian was determined to return to Ani to conduct a comprehensive photographic study of the ruins. He and his team of 4 companions encountered many hardships during the 5 months they were on location to carry out this challenging project. Working in and around the ruins of Ani, food was scarce throughout the site and in the surrounding poor villages. The absence of lodging for travelers forced Kurkdjian and his men to take refuge in the main cathedral of Surp Asvad-Adzin, or the Holy Mother of God. And here we can see the exterior and interior images of the cathedral taken by Kurkdjian, where he and his team sought shelter throughout their stay. This map or survey of Ani, which was produced in 1844, was revised by the British traveler and businessman H.F.B. Lynch in 1894. Going counterclockwise, each of the red numbers represents a site that Kurkdjian photographed. In all, he generated 40 views of Ani. Upon Kurkdjian's return to Yerevan, he published The Ruins of Ani in 1881. This album, consisting of a set of 40 stereoscopic photographs, was housed in a cloth-covered cardboard box decorated with embossed gold tooling. And here we could see 12 of the 40 views that Kurkdjian produced. Here is a large example of just one of the cards, which was a stereoscopic image. Stereoscopic photography was the art of capturing and displaying two slightly offset photographs to create the illusion of a three-dimensional picture. During this time, the production of stereoscopic photographs became a craze throughout the Western world. On each of the mounted cards, collection was inscribed on one side, as you can see on the right, in Armenian, and on the other side in French. Also, the set of 40 photographs came with two booklets, one in French and German, and the other in Armenian, but not in Russian. The art historian Heghnar Watenpaugh, who has done some research on Kurkdjian, noted, this handsome album, purposefully printed in Armenian and French and not Russian, was an example of a local's attempt to introduce his colonized people to their newly rediscovered heritage. It was part of a bigger project to resuscitate scholarly and national interest in Armenia's patrimony. The key words in this quote are not Russian. It would appear that, in part, Kurkdjian's objective with this ambitious project to photograph the ruins of Ani was to stimulate in his Armenian compatriots nationalist sentiments. A revival of Armenia's past achievements could stir up, energize, and incite these sentiments. Consequently, the Russian authorities deemed the photographs of Ani as an indication of Armenian nationalism, which undermined the Tsar's objective to fortify a highly centralized autocratic Russified state. Once Kurkdjian's stereoscopic landscapes were under the scrutiny of the Russian authorities, a closer examination of the poses and gazes of the figures within the images suggested further evidence of nationalism and sedition. When we study the people within Kurkdjian's photographs, like this one, it appears that they were carefully staged. The images of melancholic figures seemingly lost in deep thought about the glory of Armenia's past evoked in the viewer, as noted by the photography historian David Lowe, a sense of what it would be like to wander the ruins of this deserted site and to dream of a lost world. Looking at the 8 images I'll be showing, we see that the people in them appear mesmerized, enchanted, and entranced. They seem to be wistful and contemplating about the magnificence of what they are viewing. This is what concerned the Russians, as they deemed the production and dissemination of these images to be an act of sedition. So here are some enlarged images of Kurkdjian's photographs that contain people in them. And as you can see, they probably were carefully staged. And there are a few more. And the arrow is pointing to the people, since it's hard to make them out. Here in front of the cathedral on the south entrance and in the interior. Kurkdjian's images, which captured the relics of Armenia's past, not only served as a powerful tool to stimulate nationalistic sentiments in the Armenian communities within the Ottoman and Russian empires, but they also fostered public awareness in Europe and the Western world about the quote-unquote Armenian question. Hence, on an international level, reproduction of Kurkdjian's images in European periodicals, such as the London-based publication of The Graphic in 1885, garnered worldwide attention to the harrowing plight of the Armenians and the destruction of their cultural heritage by past and present foreign occupiers. And the story behind the publication of Kurkdjian's images in the graphic has been researched by David Lowe. The graphic, which was known to take an interest in social issues, was introduced to Kurkdjian's images by a London-based Armenian activist, Galabeg Hagopian, whose mission was to heighten interest in the Armenian cause. Also, it should be noted that in addition to the production of the stereoscopic ruins of Ani, Kurkdjian took part in the growing Armenian liberation movement in Yerevan. Disheartened and frustrated by the oppression of the Armenians, he noted in one of his letters, "Everything, every work in our life, instead of moving forward, seems to be coming to a standstill." So Kurkdjian's photographic work, his nationalistic fervor, and political activities came to the attention of the Russian authorities. The publication of his views of Ani contributed to accusations of sedition, which carried the threat of incarceration by the Russian government. This ultimately prompted Kurkdjian to escape Yerevan for Vienna in 1881. And so we now come to the next chapter in Kurkdjian's life. In 1885, Kurkdjian left Vienna, leaving behind him his past life in the Ottoman and Russian empires. Driven by wanderlust, he was in search of a new life, new adventures, and promising prospects for work in the colonial Dutch East Indies. Upon his arrival in Southeast Asia, Kurkdjian spent a brief period of time in Singapore. And in 1886, he settled in Surabaya, a port town on the east end of Java, Indonesia. Kurkdjian immersed himself within an established Armenian community that became a hub for Armenians who had immigrated to the Dutch East Indies. In terms of this diasporan Armenian community, what we know is that the first significant wave of Armenians, who were mostly merchants from Isfahan, Persia, and settlements in India, traveled to Batavia, known today as Jakarta, Indonesia, at the end of the 18th century. The Armenians established several prominent commercial houses engaged in trade with overseas markets. In the second half of the 19th century, the center of the Armenian community in the Dutch East Indies gradually moved from Batavia, which was in Western Java, to Surabaya in Eastern Java. On January 6, 1880, the Armenian community was formally recognized as an incorporated society by the Dutch government. Surabaya became the most important, quote-unquote, Armenian city in the Dutch East Indies around the turn of the 20th century. So while in Surabaya, Kurkdjian's strong nationalistic sentiments to liberate his Armenian compatriots suffering under Ottoman and Russian rule did not cease upon his departure from Yerevan. With fellow Armenians in Surabaya, he formed the Armenian Encouraging Union, whose mission was to promote the liberation of Western Armenians facing oppression and persecution by the Ottoman and Russian authorities. As noted, Kurkdjian's patriotism and passionate quest to assist his people in Turkey and Russia brought him honor and glory to both himself and his nation. So in Surabaya, Kurkdjian, the entrepreneur, found tremendous success as a commercial and documentary photographer. Within this multi-ethnic milieu of Armenian, Western, and indigenous inhabitants, he found, again, tremendous success. In 1890, Kurkdjian established a studio in the Botsing Sloan Square of Surabaya. Here we see both the exterior and the interior views of the studio. As Kurkdjian's studio continued to grow, in 1897, he recruited a British assistant, G.P. Lewis, who took over the reins of the studio upon Kurkdjian's passing in 1903. The studio became a very prominent establishment, and it also served as the training grounds for male and female budding photographers. And here we see the studio stamps produced over the course of the studio's long 46-year history. Those who took over the studio after Kurkdjian's passing kept the Kurkdjian name. Okay. Within the studio, Kurkdjian's photographic output ranged from artistically composed portraiture of Europeans residing in Surabaya to ethnographic portraiture of Europeans residing, in ethnographic studies of indigenous Japanese inhabitants. For the most part, both the quality and the format of Kurkdjian's portraits were similar to Western studio work. There were no major differences in the settings or poses from Western portraiture. Outside of the studio, Kurkdjian's documentary photographs consisted of many different views of Surabaya. He immersed himself in all aspects of this thriving colonialist community. Here we see images that he and his assistants took of the bustling business sections of the city and its exclusive residential quarters. We know that some of the richest figures in the Dutch East Indies were Armenians. For example, the Armenian Sarkis brothers, who were born in Isfahan, Iran, were known for founding a chain of luxury hotels throughout Southeast Asia. Here we see images taken by the Kurkdjian studio of the Oranji Hotel, which was built in Surabaya by the Sarkis brothers. Other views of Surabaya captured by Kurkdjian and his associates highlighted people that work in plantations, factories, and laboratories, as well as imagery of exotic Javanese landscapes, tropical forests, beaches, and volcanoes. Although Java is a small island, its geography has made it prone to recurrent volcanic activity. Kurkdjian and his assistants captured many of these large and small volcanic eruptions. The image of the volcanic eruption of Mount Bromo, which you can see here, was taken by Kurkdjian in 1893, and it has some writing on the top in Armenian. Following the eruption of Mount Khulud on May 23, 1901, Kurkdjian was invited by the Dutch government on June 6, 1901, to photograph the aftermath of the striking explosive eruption. This commissioned photographic assignment led to an exhibition, which was praised in one of the Dutch journals for bringing the viewer, quote, into the wild world of grandeur, of feeling alone, of becoming a small person facing infinite creation, end of quote. This is an interesting description of Kurkdjian's photographs of volcanoes, as it can also be applied to stunning photographs of the ruins of Ani that were taken some 20 years earlier. And so here we see some other striking photographs of volcanic eruptions and their aftermath captured by the Kurkdjian studio. Kurkdjian's work incorporated elements of photojournalism, such as the festivities in Surabaya on the occasion of Queen Wilhelmina's coronation to the throne on August 31st, 1898. To document this momentous event in Surabaya, Kurkdjian produced an album which incorporated views of the parade preparations and much of the pomp and circumstances that surrounded it. This highly decorative and elaborate album was presented to the Queen by Kurkdjian. In 1902, she bestowed upon Kurkdjian the royal warrant, which acknowledged his photographic studies of Indonesia during Dutch colonial rule. So what became of Kurkdjian's studio? Upon his passing in 1903, G.P. Lewis ran the studio, and in 1904, it became O. Kurkdjian and Company, a company for the exploitation of photographic atelier Kurkdjian. In 1915, the studio was taken over by a Dutch pharmaceutical importing company. The studio moved again to larger quarters and employed 30 people. So it was quite a large establishment. Under the Kurkdjian name, the studio continued to produce portraits and ethnographic studies of Indonesian people and their landscapes until it closed in 1936. So what can we say about Kurkdjian's legacy? By and large, he is regarded as one of the pioneers of Armenian photography, who was quite passionate about his craft. His skills and prolific photographic output had its roots in his ancestral homeland of Armenia, which he brought his newfound home in the Dutch East Indies. Kurkdjian recognized the potential for the camera's lens to capture a vast array of a subject matter that documented, for one, important remnants of visual culture in multiple settings, as well as significant moments in history. Today, Kurkdjian's photographs of the ruins of Ani provide us with a baseline to conduct comparative studies that assess the changes which have occurred as a result of environmental factors, neglect, desecration, vandalism, and some of the restorative work that has been done to date. And Stephen will speak more about this. Although Kurkdjian's photographic study of Ani was met with great controversy by the Russian authorities, for Armenians, these images were Kurkdjian's crown achievement and a testament to Armenia's glorious past. Vahan Kochar, the renowned Armenian photographer, characterized Kurkdjian as the founder and the originator of historical monuments and photo recording in the Armenian reality. Kurkdjian's ethnographic images of native Indonesians and their landscapes were once promoted and reproduced by agencies affiliated with the colonial Dutch East Indies. These are now historical documents that chronicle a chapter from Indonesia's distant past. However, these photographs are now representative of a very controversial era connected to Dutch colonialism, a period in history which is now fraught with harsh criticism and rejection. As such, how are we to study and interpret Kurkdjian's images of colonized people and their milieu? And what historical value do they hold? Anne Maxwell, a professor of English culture and communication, notes that photography produced during the era of the Dutch East Indies carry a strong connection to Netherlands colonialism, which means that they are today not just regarded ambivalently by photographic historians, but they are frequently overlooked. With a revision of history and a reinterpretation of the past, Kurkdjian's work may now be subject to scrutiny, criticism, and even omission. However, in spite of all the controversies surrounding some of Kurkdjian's photographs, when we study the entire corpus of his work, he remains an important figure in the history of Armenian photography. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. I think now we're ready to hear from Stephen. If you are able to share your screen and begin.
Just give me one moment until I remember the process. Can you see the full screen?
Not yet.
Try new share, hold on.
There we go. Now we can.
No. Okay, I'm just checking. And it's going forward and back. Yes. Okay, is that everything all right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thanks. Okay, firstly, I'd like to thank Carla for inviting me today to join this event, and also for a kind introduction at the beginning. Also, I want to add that I've discovered I can't see my notes when I'm full screen and screen sharing. So rather than being mistaken about dates, I'm going to be deliberately vague about dates when I'm talking. There's probably more known about and published about the Ani of 1,000 years ago than there is about the Ani of the last 100 years. And most of what I've seen about the Ani of that period that I've seen published, I would call propaganda, and that the texts contain deliberate omissions or deliberate distortions or deliberate falsehoods. And most of what I'm going to talk about hasn't been written about. My first visit to Ani was in 1984, then again in 86, then again in 89, and then every year since 1991. And the Ani that I saw in the 1980s and 1990s, it was essentially the same Ani that is depicted in Kurkdjian's photographs. There were some changes to individual buildings, some buildings had collapsed, but the overall atmosphere of Ani was the same place that was depicted in these 1880s photographs. But since the late 1990s, there's been a series of interventions at Ani which have progressively destroyed more and more of the site. And it's these changes that I'm going to talk about while comparing what was there when Kurkdjian was there. So the first cars in Khtzkonk series is the outer walls, the main ramparts, which are on the north side of Ani. And it's a double set of ramparts that were started in the 10th century and then added to over the coming centuries to reach their present form. So there's superficially, you don't see much change there, but if you look carefully, there are some changes. You can see that there's some rebuildings that's been done. This was Turkish rebuildings starting in the late 1990s. And there's also some collapses. If you can see my cursor pointing to Kurkdjian figure there. Above it, there's a part of the wall which is missing. And that's collapsed, and it collapsed quite recently. If I look at an old photograph, this is a top right photograph, is from the early 20th century, and the bottom left photograph is from the 1960s. I don't know who took the bottom left photo, I just found it on the internet. But they both show that tower with the wall still attached. I'll just get the number of the tower, and that's the Nikolai Marr, who excavated Ani in the 1900s. He numbered all the towers individually. So this tower is Tower 50. So the back of the tower was still standing in the 1960s. But if you go there today, it's collapsed. So that's the right. This shows the current condition, and to the left is what it was like until the 1960s. And you can see from this photograph, oops, sorry, go back, that reveals something about how the damages, how the decay of the buildings at Ani progress. They don't fall apart from the top down, they decay from the bottom and then they collapse. So people have come and they've undermined the masonry and taken the facing stones from underneath the wall at the base. Gradually it's become so undermined that it's weakened the structure to the extent that it's collapsed. The construction method for these walls is there's a facing stone of cut basalt on the outside, and on the inside it's a rubble concrete conglomerate. And the facing stone protects the conglomerate from weathering, and it's a conglomerate that provides the stability that supports the structure. So once the facing stone is removed, the concrete core very rapidly decays and crumbles away. And so this is what happens and it collapses. And you can see this throughout Ani. It's an ongoing process. Every year that I go to Ani, I notice more destruction from natural collapses. So for example, this tower I photographed in the 1990s. And so I should say something about the photography at Ani. It was banned during the 1980s. And I think it was 1992 that photography was possible. So this would have been from 92 or 93. And then when I went back to Ani a few years later, I looked for this tower and I couldn't find it. And eventually I discovered why I couldn't find it. That's on the right is what's left of the tower. This photograph is from Krikor Balakian's book about the ruins of Ani, and it shows the tower. So these are the same views from 1900s and today. and the tower is entirely fallen. And it was still standing probably until about the year 2000, 2001, perhaps. So this is card 2 of Kurkdjian's series. It's impossible to reproduce this view now because starting in 1995, Turkey, the Turkish Ministry of Tourism started a project to rebuild the walls, and it was an extremely damaging process that seriously altered the appearance of the walls, and a lot of archaeology was destroyed or hidden behind new buildings. That's the Lion Gate, and most of what you see there is modern. All of this unworn masonry is modern. The arch is completely modern and just a fabrication. The old drawings of Ani don't show an arch that looks like that. So this, starting in 1995, the debris and earth that had grown up over hundreds of years and deposited over hundreds of years was cleared away. Though it wasn't an excavation, an archaeological excavation, they just cleared it away using bulldozers, diggers, and dumped the soil somewhere. And then the walls were rebuilt using modern machine cut stone. And so that's, on the left is rebuilt walls, on the right is what they look like. So these little marks you see on the walls, on stonework, these are arrowheads that have done that during the various sieges of the city. So as well as making the walls very ugly, they are destroying the evidence of the history of the site. And these walls, the rebuildings went on for about 10 years, and there was no criticism anywhere as they were progressing. At the time, there was a French archaeological expedition at Ani from the Sorbonne, and rather than criticizing the restorations of the walls, they were completely silent. And the fact went even further than that, and they suppressed criticism of it. Because at the time I was in communication with a French author who was trying to get an article published in a French archaeological periodical. And she was writing about the damaging excavations and the damaging reconstructions of the walls. And in order to check the facts of the article, the publishers contacted the archaeological team from the Sorbonne, and they replied by saying that they had no objections to anything that was happening at Ani, and that what was contained in the article bore no resemblance to accuracy. So nothing, when it's now permitted to, you'll find archaeologists criticizing what happened in the 1990s and the 2000s. But at the time, they were all completely silent. And this is what happens when you pile a lot of new masonry onto medieval masonry. It's much heavier, and the concrete is heavier, and this is what happens. So the original wall tower, this was a tower on the outer walls, and it was rebuilt, and then it collapsed completely. And this is card 3 of Kurkdjian's series, and it's not possible to reproduce that view now because of the modern rebuilt wall. It doesn't allow you enough space to stand far enough back to take that photograph. But it hasn't really changed much, and the inscription above the gate is still there. It's a completely boring inscription about taxes rather than anything interesting about the history of Ani. It's dates from the Mongol period. And also at the gateway to Ani, there's the famous signpost, which lots of people have written about and noted, that it doesn't contain any mention of Armenia or Armenians. And it talks about the Bagrats and so on, but it doesn't actually mention Armenia or Armenians anywhere. And it gives fabricated history that there were Turks here in 626 BC. And this signpost has gone through various versions. So that's 2 of them. There was one before that, which I couldn't photograph because the photography was banned at Ani at that time. And this is the current version now. Again, it doesn't mention Armenians anywhere. But it stops calling these people, to whoever these Iskits are. They're no longer referred to as Turks, so there's some small improvement. But again, there's no mention anywhere of Armenians. And this was another change that happened at Ani briefly in the 2000s. So somebody decided to change the name of Ani and change its pronunciation and change its official spelling. So it was no longer Ani, it was to be called Ani. And so all the street signs and the road directions to Ani were changed. And there's 2 different I's in Turkish. There's a dotted I and an undotted I. And the undotted I is pronounced eh. So that changed the pronunciation. By removing the dot, it changes the pronunciation from Ani to Ani. After a couple of years, this was, they went back to the original pronunciation and somebody had to peel the masking tape off. Card 4. Again, it's not a great deal of change. This here is an entirely new construction, part of the Turkish rebuilding that took place in the 2000s. And there's been some legitimate conservation work, like filling in the missing facing stones that were risking undermining this tower. So some of it's a legitimate conservation, like here, and some of it's just it performs no purpose, like the rebuilding. But there's one detail about Kurkdjian's photograph that's probably the decade or so after he was here, it collapsed. It is if you look closely, there are the remains of a corridor, a vaulted corridor behind the entrance, which has collapsed, and there's no longer any evidence of it. But this corridor indicates why there's what's called a murder hole in defensive architecture. Up here, there's a chamber and there's an opening in the ceiling, and they would drop stones or pour down oil or hot water and things on any besiegers who had broken through the gate. But it only works if you're in an enclosed space. So that doesn't make sense on its own. But when you realize that there was a corridor, a large long vaulted corridor behind the door, which would trap any attacker, the hole does make sense. And there's probably a whole series of such holes all the way along the top of this vaulted corridor. And this is card 5. Again, not a lot of change. There's always, when you look at the walls, you see pieces of the walls have fallen away. So there's the top of the wall has gone. There's a little window there, which no longer exists. And there's much more of the base is undermined. And there's more collapsed masonry here, which is not showing on Kurkdjian's photograph. Also, something has changed here. This part here is lost part of its facing stone. And card 6. So I think I'm standing at the same position as the figure is standing. So he's not just randomly placed there, he's looking out over the view. So he's looking out, seeing what I'm seeing on this photograph. And again, card 7, there's not much has changed, except there's now a village outside Ani, which didn't exist in the 1880s. The village itself was founded when Russia took over this region. And card 8 shows the second building of the Ani that's been destroyed by restoration. So the left photograph is Kurkdjian's, and the right is what the building looks like now. So about half of what you see in this photograph is new. The most troubling thing is what they did to the gateway. This gateway is quite famous for its stone inlay. Each of the little star tiles had an individual pattern. And it said that people would try to prize them off and take them away as souvenirs, and that's why throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century, each photograph you see, there's less and less of them there. So by the 1990s, on the left, that's what was left of the inlay is very little. And during the Turkish restoration, or so-called restoration, they pulled off all of the surviving inlays and then randomly distributed them around the mosaic that they were recreating. And they didn't match the pattern. So on the original, stars are at the very top, but on the reconstruction, they're one row down, and there's these black cross mosaics are inserted. There's also other inexplicable damage, like what's happened to this carved stone here, which was existing in the 1990s, but now is not. And part of the arch has also vanished. And again, this shows what happens when you pile a lot of new masonry on top of medieval masonry. This was the rebuilt palace in its original rebuilt form. You can see the ghost of what was a wall. So this was been a city wall that came out from the palace and surrounded the edge of the ravine. And behind the wall, there must have been a wooden walkway, and that's these square holes there are supports for the wooden walkway. And when I came back to Ani a few years after taking this photograph, this is what I found. So the entire original wall there has collapsed, and they've had to rebuild it and rebuild the new masonry that they put on top. So you can compare before and after. And that's the back of the palace. There's nothing there which is original. And these windows, they're just randomly placed there. There's no archaeological evidence that there were windows there. And locally, the building is referred to now as the prison, because it looks like a prison from the outside. So this is Kurkdjian's card 15. Again, there's not much that's changed in this one. When Nikolai Marr was excavating at Ani, he tried to restore some of the buildings by those that were about to collapse because the foundations had been undermined. He tried to replace the masonry. So what you see there is Russian era stonework put there by Nikolai Marr to help stop the building collapsing. And this is Turkish. It doesn't do anything. It's just for show, this pillar. And that's what it's like inside. That again, it hasn't changed. But Nikolai Marr was very worried that the whole building was about to collapse, and that's why he did the restoration of the base, and it is still in an unstable condition. But it's by far the most elaborate stonework that you can find at Ani. And that what you see there is just half of the original building. There was another vault to the right, duplicating, probably with different patterns, but duplicating the design of this side. And this stalactite vault was in the middle. And as well as restoring the building, Nikolai Marr also excavated the building and its surroundings. And one of the things he found was this Khtzkonk on the left. It was in fragments and he reassembled it. This is the tombstone of Catholicos Barseg. He's one of the Catholici that the Armenian Church don't recognize, or they call him an anti-Catholicos, because by that time the Catholicos states had transferred to the Mediterranean, but there was a rival Catholicos set up at Ani, and this was his tombstone. And I went looking for the fragments one year, and I found a piece of one of them, one piece of it. So this is the, sorry, this fragment here fits in here. About 10 years ago, Turkish archaeologists cleared the entire site of grass. Basically, they were clearing back to what Nikolai Meyer had uncovered, and all these stones were removed, and I don't know what's happened to them. Nothing the archaeologists, nothing that the Turkish archaeologists have excavated and found at Ani has ever been put on public display, and nobody knows even where they're stored. So after the Apostles' Church, Kurkdjian goes to card 17, and this is a church of St. Gregory of the Bucharest. Almost all the churches in Ani are dedicated to St. Gregory, despite the fact that St. Gregory never had anything to do with Ani. There are no actual sites at Ani or surrounding Ani that are connected to St. Gregory, the Illuminator, but despite that, a lot of the churches are named St. Gregory. And this one was the family of the chapel of the Bucharest. So the left is Kurkdjian, the right is its condition after a recent Turkish restoration. They rebuilt part of the walls. It wasn't really necessary, and this very untidy work. And this is fiberglass. And the capping stone is also fiberglass. There's a little bit of history behind this, the top of the dome. So on the left is what it originally looked like after the restoration, and on the right is what it now looks like. When there was a restoration of Akhtamar, there was a big controversy over putting a cross on the roof or not. And so in order to forestall any such debate at Ani, originally they put this metal plinth, this pinnacle finial at the top of the dome. But then there wasn't really any controversy. Nobody bothered mentioning the cross situation again. And so after a while, it was replaced by this on the right. It's fiberglass, and it's lightweight, and it's actually blowing off. It's moved from its original location. Inside this church, there is a large number of tourist graffiti from the late 18th century, early 19th century. It's all mostly in Armenian, and in the 2000s, at Ani, an organization that's called the Global Heritage Fund, they basically threw out the French archaeologists, and it was for their fundraising purposes, they needed to have exclusivity over Ani, and they also took photographs. So in some archives somewhere, there's about 10,000 photographs of Ani taken at this period. And I met the photographer, and I'd asked him about whether he had been photographing these graffiti inscriptions from the turn of the last century. And he told me that he had been told expressly to not take photographs of them. So after that, I went back to Ani and took as many as I could, because they're the sort of thing that's not preserved, and they probably contain a lot of interesting information. I've only had one translated, which is this one. And so it's somebody who's come from Karen, from Erzurum. Two people have come from Erzurum in 1903. And it's almost like a short poem, and they're talking about Ani as if it's a person. But there's dozens of others still to be translated. There are two places at Ani where you can see this sort of graffiti. one inside this church, and there's also in the underground city, in one of the caves next to the tomb of Tigran Honens. The walls are whitewashed, and there's a lot of graffiti there of this sort. Again, none of it's ever been properly studied. And as you walk around Ani, you find lots of piles of rubble concrete like this. The more you look, the more of it you see. And this is because of the method the Turkish archaeologists use to preserve the walls that they've uncovered. So rather than doing it the right way, which is called soft capping, which means you put some earth on top and you plant grass on it, and the grass surface protects and holds the walls together, what the Turks do is they cap it with concrete, and well, basically it's just cement. And in the severe weather you get in cars, this only lasts maybe a couple of years, and so it has to be replaced every few years. And rather than removing the fragments from Ani, they're just dumped over unexcavated areas of the site. So that's the old concrete and cement capping, and these are the walls that it came off of, and they're just going to be covered again with the same thing, and it'll last a few years more, and then they'll have to replace it again. And again, you find piles of leftovers for mixing the concrete and the cement. So this is just rough sand. Again, it's covering unexcavated parts of Ani and contaminating those areas. And the debris from the excavations is just dumped on site as well. And it's not just the Turks that do it. These are the French archaeologists. So this was 2005. This photograph was taken, and these are the French people over here, and these are just Turkish laborers. So they're clearing part of the corner of the cathedral collapsed in the earthquake in the 1980s that affected Gyumri in Armenia. And so they're clearing away the debris. And rather than properly removing it from the site, they just carted it off to another part of Ani and dumped it. So maybe future archaeologists might wonder, was there a large building located in this site where, well, why is all this rubble here? Actually, it's leftovers from the cathedral. Even the paths that the tourists walk along are fabricated. This is not a real medieval roadway. It's just been laid out, and all these stones that the workers are putting down, they've been taken from genuine ruined buildings. And the paths themselves, they run over the foundations of buildings. One part, it goes over gravestones, and you see cars and trucks going up and down these roads. From the St. Gregory of the Bukomir's Church, Kurkdjian then moves up onto the citadel. And this is an old photograph from maybe probably about 1910, and it shows two buildings that the Russians built under Nikolai Marl's expedition. One of those was a museum, and the top left photograph shows that museum today. In the 1990s, the interior was still full of stone fragments, of carved stone fragments. Photography was banned when I walked over it the first time, and so I never took photographs of the fragments. And when I came back a few years later, they were almost all gone. Only the very heavy items are still there. And you can see things which are mentioned in Nikolai Mar's museum guidebook. This is up in the citadel, car 20. This photograph is actually the best stereo view in Kurkdjian's set. I don't think, Joe might be annoyed if I say this, but I don't think Kurkdjian was a very good stereo photographer. A lot of the cards in his set, they have no stereo effect at all. A good stereo view has one which has got multiple planes. So each of these fragments of masonry and carvings counts as a separate plane. So it's almost extraordinary 3D effect on this card, which a lot of the other cards in the series don't have. That's the same view today. The whole archway entrance is gone. You can see that's the niche that you see in Kurkdjian's photograph. And there is the edge of the door jamb that you can see in Kurkdjian's photograph. But everything else has collapsed since Kurkdjian's time. I don't know when this collapse occurred. It may be as late as the 1960s. And from the citadel, Kurkdjian looks over the river and over towards Kizkali Peninsula. Then he comes back down to this building, this card 21, which was a mosque. And Nikolai Mar converted the mosque, the ruined, abandoned mosque, into a museum. So this wall that blocks the arch was built during the Russian period. And you used to be able to go up the minaret, but it's now, since probably the last 20 years, there's been a gate and it's been locked. That's a view from the top of the minaret. That now you can't go up. And it's also been changed. There's the main architect that's responsible for the damaging restorations at Ani. His name's Yavuzovskaya, and he designed this canopy capping on top of the minaret and on top of the roof of the mosque. And Nikolai Mar actually investigated the roof of the mosque, and he discovered that it originally had it was grass, but the grass had this gentle slope in two sides, and in the middle of the bottom of the slope there was a gutter taking the rainwater away from the roof. But now there's just a metal roof on top. And this construction was probably a forewarning of what was going to happen to the mosque. The Ani Mosque, like all the former mosques in Turkey, they're the churches that were mosques for a while and then that were converted into museums. There's been a process in which they're being reconverted back into mosques, and this is what's happened to the mosque at Ani. So it's now an active mosque again. Active in the sense that it's visited maybe once a day by a mullah who switches on the recording of the call to prayer. But for 99% of the time, the building is now locked. So this, 2 years ago, this happened. And although all the other examples of historic buildings being converted into mosques have been reported in the news, this, for some reason, was unreported. I've never seen a single mention of this having happened anywhere. But that's the mullah driving up to the minaret, up to the mosque, to switch on the recording. Turkish mullahs are similar to Armenian priests in that they don't like their expensive Italian shoes getting dusty, so they have to drive everywhere. I'm going to take a little detour from the order of Kurkdjian's cards, so I'm going to jump to card 37. So this is on the left is Kurkdjian's view, and this is what it looks like today as a result of another restoration. So all of the original roofing was, most of it was removed, and a lot of new masonry was added. And the conical part of the dome was not rebuilt. Again, this is because the Turks didn't want a repeat of the controversy over the Akhtamar cross. they didn't want a repeat of that. So this is Oskaya's architectural drawing, designing it. So that from the outset, it was designed to not have the conical roof rebuilt. They could quite easily have been rebuilt, and it was a conscious design decision. He was instructed to not rebuild the dome. And already it's so badly built, the new parts of the masonry, that it's beginning to fall apart. And those are the old roofing tiles. Some of them were taken off during the restoration, others were found lying on the ground. Rather than any of them being reused, they're just left lying there, and everything that's new, everything that was rebuilt is new masonry. So that's what it looked like before the rebuilding, and that's what it looks like now. It looks like as if it's a newly built structure. It's significant that on all the tourist publicity photographs that you ever see of Ani, you never see the restored buildings. It's always what they looked like before the restorations. And I challenge anybody to prefer what you see on the right to what it looked like on the left. As card 31, this building split apart in 1955. Nikolai Meyer had rebuilt missing masonry at the bottom, but by the 1950s, all that masonry had been pulled off, and either as a deliberate attempt to hasten the building's destruction or just to steal the stones to reuse them. And it's hard to tell which it was. So it almost split almost down the middle, and it was by far the most iconic building at Ani. Everybody who came to Ani, they made a beeline for this building to see it. It's quite a spectacular ruin, or it was quite a spectacular ruin. And it's almost impossible to not take a spectacular photograph of it. That's it in winter time. And you often saw artists drawing the ruin. Or you could go there and contemplate the ruins. But this is what it looks like now. This work, it started in 2011. And it's actually a project funded by the American government. It's under the Ambassadors Fund project, and which writers have described as sort of CIA-inspired exercise in soft power. So it inserts American political agendas into foreign countries. So the commission projects that are there to advance American agendas. And the project at Ani has by far the biggest grant. So far, I think it's about $800,000 that was given, and the project was subcontracted to the World Monument Fund. So now you can't approach the ruin at all, and this scaffolding was inserted inside. It's not actually designed to support the structure in any way. It doesn't touch it, and I'm not clear exactly what its purpose is, other than providing somewhere for workers to get to the top and the bottom safely. And so this was erected in 2012, and according to the report that the World Monument Fund sent to the US government, the scaffolding was only intended to be there for 2 years at the most. So it should have been gone in 2014, but it is still there. And there's been basically almost no work done on it. So I don't know what they spent their $800,000 on. there's a visiting mason from Armenia who's gradually replacing the missing masonry at the base of the church, but nothing else has changed. And the scaffolding that was meant to be gone in 2 years is still there a decade later. The World Monument Fund themselves have moved on. Ironically, though, on their current fundraising video, the Church of the Redeemer is shown, but significantly it's shown before their interventions. Like I said, for photographs of Ani, you never see the current buildings in their restored state being used because they look so horrible. So people prefer to use the before photographs. And you think the World Monument Fund, since they were responsible for making all these changes, they at least would want to boast about what they did, but they don't. And the video itself doesn't mention Ani anywhere. That's because the World Monument Fund have moved on to another site at Ani. They're moving on to the cathedral. So that's card 23, it shows the cathedral. There's not much change there, but I'm using an old view. So Joe was mentioning the poses that the people have, and I've noticed there's a similarity in some of the poses to this famous painting, Armenia in Mourning. So it dates from there are various versions of it, but it dates back to the 1850s. And it might just be a coincidence, since this gesture wasn't invented in this engraving of melancholic contemplation of ruins, but it's possible that they are deliberately referencing this, which became a symbol of Armenian patriotism and was actually banned in the Ottoman Empire and also banned in parts of the Russian Empire as well. So going back to the cathedral, that's what it looks like now. It's entirely cased in scaffolding. And this is the World Monument Fund, again, that are doing this. But it's paid, rather than it being paid for by the US government this time, it's being paid for by the Saudi equivalent of the Ambassador's Fund. So this is a Gulf state equivalent of US soft power. And so this ALIPH is apparently a fund, well, it's a fund set up by Saudi Arabia and mostly paid for by Saudi Arabia, set up 2 years ago. And it's ostensibly for repairing buildings in conflict zones, but I don't see how Ani can be called a conflict zone. Maybe 1,000 years ago it was, but it's long since ceased to be a conflict zone. And so really it's just a way of Saudi Arabia inserting its foreign policy interests into Turkey. Because this happened just after Khashoggi was murdered in Istanbul. This fund was announced. So it's a way of Saudi Arabia trying to reestablish itself. It is as a fund, as something of influence. But none of these restorations are done for proper conservation reasons. Everything that's happening at Ani is done for political reasons. Nothing really is there for conservation or archaeological reasons. So there's the news about this fund, Saudi Arabia donating 30 million. And that's from February last year. And that is probably what the cathedral is going to look like afterwards. Again, this is all Yavuzovskaya's work. He's very fond of fiberglass. I think he would restore the Venus de Milo by sticking fiberglass arms onto her missing arms. So it's just a fake dome and with fake roofs here, all made out of fiberglass. And there's no purpose to it. There's the dome opening itself is not, having it open is not doing any damage. It's been open for probably 600 or 700 years, and there's no real damage done by having it that way. So after the cathedral, we'll go down to this is called the Convent of the Virgins. So Kurkdjian goes down to the gorge, has a look at this building, photographs it, and then goes down to the bridge. If you can just see on the top of this photograph, you can see some rubble just at the very edge of the top of this picture. This is from a set of quarries which were started in Armenia. They were initially opened to price stone for the St. Gregory the Illuminated Cathedral in Yerevan. So it was the 1890s, the 1990s that it was first opened. And from the Turkish side, at first they thought that someone was building some sort of visitor center or viewing platform. But after a while, it became clear it was quarries. And since that time, each year the quarries get bigger and cover more areas. So there are now like a half a dozen separate quarries opposite Ani, and there are also quarries opposite the site of Ohannes Monastery, opposite the site of Magasberg Castle, and opposite the site of Marin Cathedral. And there are explosions that take place inside the quarry, which are felt across the border at Ani, despite the fact that such explosions have been denied by the Armenian government. That's a photograph of the aftermath of one of the explosions. And I've got several other photographs of other explosions as proof that they do happen. And there will be archaeological sites on the Armenian side of the Ani site, but there's never been any investigations. So the top photograph shows the debris field of the quarries advancing down over the plateau. And in this particular year, there was a very serious fire that took place on the Armenian side, and all the grass was completely destroyed. And for the first time, it revealed what was on the Armenian side. And you can see this is the remains of a graveyard. So the edge of this graveyard extends to the edge of this debris field. And each year the debris field expands and gets closer and closer to the gravestones. And there's been no archaeological investigations on the Armenian side. And as well as the areas of the individual quarries increasing each year, there's also new ones opened every year. So this is a new quarry. And again, you see the settlement site and the quarry and the debris just beginning to fall down over the edges of this settlement site. I think this is just on the other side of the Ani citadel. So it might be medieval or it might be later. But since nobody's done any archaeology on the Armenian side, I don't know what these ruins are. And so this is card 33 of Kurkdjian's photographs. It shows the Ani Bridge. And about the same view in my photograph. There's not been much changes to the bridge. Part of the top of the bridge structure has fallen. There was a window here, but now there's just a sort of gap where the window was. And there have been a large number of ridiculous reconstructions of the Ani Bridge. This is from a Turkish publication from 1996, and it Turkifies the bridge into a sort of Mostar-style Ottoman bridge with a sloping roadbed. The Ani Bridge didn't look anything like that originally. This is a crazy reconstruction by an Armenian author who I won't name because I don't want to embarrass them. This is just, I don't know what to say about this. This is complete fantasy. Nothing that's there reflects what the bridge looked like. This is Toramanian's drawing of a reconstruction of the bridge. It's closer than any of the other ones, but it's still not very accurate. And this tower that you see here didn't exist in reality, and these were not open like that. They were closed off. And same, that opening there didn't exist. It was closed off. And the interior of the bridge was the void here, and there are windows for ventilation, but I don't think it was ever used for anything. So there was no opening. And this is a 3D, a more recent reconstruction. I'll get the person's name, just give me a moment, I noted it down. Pargev Frankian did this. It does look realistic superficially, but again, it's not really realistic at all. This drawbridge is just fantasy. There's no drawbridges anywhere in Armenian medieval architecture. And this tower, as I said, doesn't exist. There's only a tower on one side, not two. And the whole design misunderstands the purpose of the Ani Bridge. It wasn't built for defense, it was built to control trade. So rather than having windows here, as he's depicted, there's actually just large windows at the side of the tower, so that people inside the sentry control point could check whether people were trying to cross the river illicitly and trying to avoid paying the dues that they would need to enter the city with their trade goods. So the reconstruction is right, and it shows the platform there. So from the bridge, the road was secure and went up to the city, and there's not an access. There's no way, once from down here, there's no way of accessing this road. So the only way to get into the roadway would be to cross via the bridge. So the only way into the city would be to go through the control point at the bridge, and for whatever taxes had to be paid would be paid here. Unfortunately, the bridge has become adopted as a symbol for the current situation between Turkey and Armenia. So that's two books that use the bridge as a metaphor, and I've been guilty of doing it myself. That's my photograph that they've used, but I didn't quite realize the bad future implications of this comparison. That as well as Armenia wanting to restore and Turkey wanting to restore, and then the international community wanting to restore, and the link between Armenia and Turkey and open the border, that this has become now interpreted as a need to rebuild the Ani Bridge. And so only last month, Armenia's foreign ministry, Ararat Mirzoyan, I think his name was, Mirzoyan, he went to Turkey with an aid convoy for the earthquake relief. The cynics among us will wonder, why can Armenia send earthquake relief across a closed border that's been closed for 30 years, and they can't send relief to fellow Armenians besieged in Artsakh? But it's beside the point for the bridge. But when Mirzoyan was in Turkey, Turkey and Armenia announced a joint project to rebuild the Ani Bridge as a preliminary act towards opening the border. And look at the bridge. This bridge cannot be rebuilt. The most that could ever happen to it would be for it to be consolidated and preserved. I've shown pictures of what happens when you build new things on top of medieval masonry. Masonry just can't support it, and it'll collapse. And this is if this was going to be rebuilt, it would be a bridge which had to be strong enough for people to walk on, presumably. So really, a project to reconstruct this bridge is actually a project to destroy it. And as well as the destruction of the bridge, you're going to have to destroy a large part of Ani as well, because this is the route of the original approach to the bridge. And that's the city gate, and the pathway curves down towards the Virgin's convent, but it doesn't actually run to the convent because there's a little valley between the two, and it turns around to the right, turns around, and then goes down to the bridge via what would have been an artificial platform. causeway type road. And there's no way anybody could take heavy equipment down here to this site. So as well as destroying the bridge, a large part of Ani is going to have to be destroyed if this project goes ahead. And the only way it's going to stop if people, experts, archaeologists, building conservationists protest about this plan. So hopefully the bridge can remain as it is, with perhaps a little bit of consolidation and restoration of the missing masonry. But if this project goes ahead, it'll essentially mean the destruction of yet another part of Ani, and the destruction, like all the other destructions, will be taking place for political reasons rather than for archaeological reasons. So that's the last slide. I hope I haven't taken too long to go through everything, but I hope it's been quite illuminating about the current situation at Ani.
Fascinating talk. Thank you so much, Stephen, and also Joe. We have a great many questions, and I think we will just have time for a few of them. But let me just mention one thing that a couple of our attendees have noted. So at the UCLA Library Special Collections, our librarian Nora Avetian notes that the correspondence between the Sarkis brothers and family and albums of photographs from Sarabia actually are there at the UCLA Library. This is in reference to what Joe spoke about. And then in reference to what Stephen has commented on, Heghnar from Armenia notes that at least there are 2 commentary books on Ani visitors that are kept in the National Archives there that date to the early 1900s. So just for a reference for our viewers. We have a great many questions. Perhaps, Carla, would you like to ask one of them? We won't have time for all, but we will try to consolidate a few of these.
Well, one of the questions you answered actually about the image of Mother Armenia, but the question from our audience participant was, do you think that the Mother Armenia was influenced by the Kurkdjian photo, or was it the, what was the causality of that? I suppose there's no way of proving that, is there?
Well, I think that these cards were quite luxury products. They would have been very expensive at the time. So I don't think ordinary people would know about them. But the image itself was mass marketed, and people actually bought. You could buy embroidery copies of it. They would embroider. So you get the pattern, you would embroider it. And I've got 2 of them. So
and
you also got it as postcards. You also got the images was available as postcards, and it was reproduced in lots of forms. So I don't think the photographs contributed to its popularity, to the Mother Armenia image.
Right. I mean, there's a question also that you answered a number of times in your presentation about is the majority of the destruction man-made, or is there also some weathering over time? I think you've said both. I mean, it's both man-made and it's weathering, and political decisions that are obviously man-made. I mean, it's hard to sort of assess 50% man-made, 50% weather, or is it mainly man-made, the destruction?
Probably 80% man-made at the moment, and 20% natural destruction. And all of most of the natural destruction could be prevented if it was intelligent interventions. So rather than restoring buildings to make them look as if they're new, you just use the same amount of money, but you repair all the missing masonry that's on the bases of the walls. So each year I go to Ani, there's always a new damage. So a new wall has collapsed somewhere at some point. And often because I've been there a lot of times, you don't notice when you're there, but then you check your photographs and it's like, yeah, that wall is no longer there. Or there's a course of masonry at the top of that wall which has fallen, and there's always little details like that.
Anne, your turn.
Okay, well, we have a number of questions that actually pertain to this reconstruction by various nation state, by Turkey, by Saudi Arabia, by the United States. So the original materials that were used, you mentioned, were basalt, outer stone for protection. Does any of that reconstruction use the sort of local materials that would have been used, or it's all like concrete, etc.?
No. Although, in fairness, it would be to get the local material, you would have to use a local quarry, and I don't know whether there's any. If you're walking around the hinterland of Ani and the countryside around it, you find the traces of quarrying, stone quarrying everywhere. So it must have been quite an active industry to core the stone. And there's in some parts you see immense hills of rubble leftovers from the quarrying and the chipping away of the surface facings of the stones. But there are no quarries that are active. And I think the stone, the main place for stone at the moment in eastern Turkey comes from Aklat on Lake Van. And that's also where a lot of the stonemasons come from, because the buildings there, Aklat and Bitlis, the traditional masonry skills are still found there. So that's probably where they get the stone from. So I don't know exactly, but it's not the same stone as you get at Ani. It's darker and it's kind of heavier as well.
Let me just pose a question that we have for Joe. So what do we know about Kurkdjian's Tiflis period? You had mentioned when he was in Yerevan and Sarabia. There is a studio that was there, is that right? That was
according to the literature, there was. I really don't know much. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, what did he do in Tiflis? And I think the other thing that we're trying to uncover is what did he produce in Yerevan? Because he did have a photographic studio there, and then in Tiflis. I think it's a matter of going into the archives, and then also there's probably, hopefully, a wealth of information and images in Amsterdam, in Netherlands, and Leiden University, and Tropen Museum. So I would imagine that there's a lot there, and then in Yerevan as well. So we have to uncover all of this. I know that Vigen Gastyan has been quite interested in Kurkdjian, and he's been doing some work in this area. So I think it's going into the archives and going in much deeper to see what we can uncover. But I really don't know what he did produce in Tiflis and how long he was there. Even, what did he do in Vienna for about 4 years? It's hard to say. And this is the period after he escaped Yerevan because there was the threat of incarceration. So we have to piece together his history, and we really don't know much about his personal history. In Surabaya, was he married? Was there a family? Where was he buried? I know that the community has gotten much smaller, and to some degree, very few people are living there. So a lot to uncover. I think it's a matter of, probing deeper into all of the archives across these regions.
Right, and I have a question, which is kind of going back to international efforts for restoration. Stephen, you've had some dealings with UNESCO. Do you think that part of this campaign, at least from the Armenian diasporan community, should we be agitating, protesting to UNESCO about some of these renovations? Is that a fruitful area to go down, route to go down?
No. I mean, UNESCO is part of the problem. UNESCO have listed Ani, and they've listed it despite all the damage that's been done there and all the damage that has continued to be done since the listing. But UNESCO is mostly politics.
They're enabling some of these bad renovation exercises, in your opinion.
Yes. I mean, there are plenty of other things at Ani that go completely against what a World Heritage site should be. For example, there's no refuge collection system at Ani. All the rubbish from tourist debris, the cans of Coke and so on, when they're emptied, they're just dumped in the caves. So some of the caves at Ani have it's like Hazar Shen type roofs with a hole at the top, and in the caves, and people just come and when they're clearing the rubbish bins from Ani, they just dump all the rubbish down the hole and fill the cave up from the center out. And the other parts, are inside the walls. Some of the inside interiors of some of the towers. Again, you go in there and you see piles of burnt rubbish. So that's where they dispose of the rubbish.
So in some ways, when you mentioned the comparison to Akhtamar and the restoration, they're trying not to do things that can be compared to Akhtamar. So in some ways, the Akhtamar example is getting in the way, although that who's to say what they would have done regardless of Akhtamar, but it's like we can't win in this situation.
Right. The answer is just to do to Ani what you would do to any archaeological site, and take out the politics. Akhtamar too was a political restoration, and it was done on the back of a lot of, to be honest, Armenian propaganda about the building about to collapse. Akhtamar was never in any danger of collapsing. The most that was ever wrong with Akhtamar was some of the roof tiles were beginning to come off, and one of the cornice that had a relief on it that had fallen off. This was very minor work, but Turkey used the decades of Armenian propaganda about Akhtamar being almost ready to be destroyed. They used that and then turned it against Armenia by actually restoring the building. And it wasn't a real restoration that was necessary. So it went far too far. It was a very heavy-handed restoration. And it's like Akhtamar, like several of the buildings at Ani, now looks as if it's newly built.
Right, yes. Yes, well, go, Anne, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time just for a couple more questions, but one relates to the recent earthquake. Are you aware of any significant damage that was done in that part of Turkey?
I don't think anything. Well, I'm not aware of any. The earthquake didn't affect eastern Turkey at all. It did at Diyarbakir, but that's more south of the area. It's a different geological area.
So have you found it, I mean, as over the last couple of decades, several decades in which you've spent time there, Stephen, it's remarkable how the region has evolved, the engagement or not of the government of Turkey has been involved, and even actions on the part of Armenia when there was mining that affected Ani. Can you maybe encapsulate in just a few sentences your feelings as an architect, as an now archaeologist in many respects, on this evolution and what you see for the future?
I just see more destruction. I mean, as I was doing the research for this talk, I discovered the pronouncement that Armenia had been making about the rebuilding the bridge, and I'd also found out about the Saudi foundation paying for the restoration of the cathedral. And I'm using the word restoration as an insult. The proper word that if what was happening at Ani was done properly, it would be conservation. That would be the term that I would be using. Restoration is like a 19th century term. It's obsolete. Nobody would restore a building if the option of conserving that building was there. The best thing that I've ever heard somebody say about conservation versus restoration is I think it was maybe 20 years ago, and it was in British television, and it was a castle in Scotland which had been quite a lot of money has been spent conserving it. There was a semi-ruined castle, and the reporter was saying that he couldn't see any change to the building. And to this, the conservator replied, "Yes, but thanks to our work, they will continue to look as if nothing has changed for the next 100 years." So that's what needs to happen to Ani. It needs to be conserved as it is to make sure that nothing changes. Not rebuilt as if it was never in ruins.
And just to remind our viewers, listeners here, you can look at Stephen Sim's photos that he referred to in this presentation, along with Kurkdjian's stereoscopic images on the exhibit that'll be online from Friday. And Khtzkonk will put the link in the chat box for you, armenianimage.org. We are very grateful for your work, Stephen Sim, over the years, and I know it's partly a mission of passion, and you feel it in your bones. I know that, having only been there once, and I think once you see it, it stays with you forever, for what that's worth. And even was talking to Khtzkonk Bagdasarian before we began, and Khtzkonk, who comes from Armenia, says, Ani is something that we see over the border, just, stone's throw away, and it's a symbol for so many of us. It means a lot to so many people. So we're grateful to you. And Joseph Malikian's presentation, thank you, Joe, for giving us that oversight of Ohannes Kurkdjian, and giving us the background to his story. So we're very grateful.
Yes, and thanks from me as well, from our Promise Armenian Institute. Thank you to both Joe and Stephen for a magnificent presentation. We all look forward to viewing many more details on the archive beginning this coming Friday. Thank you to Carla for coordinating this truly amazing webinar and conversation. I wish we could go on and on. We have many, many more questions, but we will communicate these to our speakers, and if they are able, they'll respond to some of them specifically. So now let me take the opportunity to close our webinar by noting that the Promise Armenian Institute actually has a number of events that are planned in the near future, and access to them is all available on our website. So just to remind you, on Friday, March 17 at 10 a.m. and Saturday, March 18 at 12 noon Pacific, Professor Sebu Aslanyan is hosting a hybrid, that is in-person and remote conference on behalf of his Richard Hovannisian Chair in Modern Armenian History on the subject of Armeno-Indica, 4 Centuries of Familiarity and Friendship. And then on Saturday, March 25 at 8 a.m. Pacific, Dr. Taner Akçam, who is the director of our Armenian Genocide Research Program, will be partnering with the Center for the Study of Law and Genocide at Loyola Law and Nasser, presenting an all-day hybrid conference at UCLA entitled What's Next? Armenian Genocide Restitution in the Post-Recognition Era. And then finally, on Wednesday, April 12 at 7 p.m. Pacific, the Promise Armenian Institute is very honored to present its inaugural endowed Kur Family Lecture. This one is entitled The Extraordinary Humanitarian Legacy of the Near East Relief and 3 Generations of Kurs, Warriors of Peace. This will be presented by documentary filmmaker Ani Hovannisian, and with commentary by Emeritus Professor Richard Hovannisian. So this event, as I say, will be at UCLA in person, but will also be live streamed. So there are many other events planned for the coming months by the Promise Armenian Institute. So please check out our website or social media to see more details on our programming. Before closing, let me offer once again our thanks to the speakers, to Carla, and to our wonderful Promise Armenian Institute Deputy Director, Khtzkonk Bagdasarian, who has been working behind the scenes in coordinating this and on virtually all of our other events. So thank you once again for your participation, and we look forward to having you at future events hosted